To hear and to listen to. Listen to, listen to, listen to, listen to, listen to. Siempre con tú, excepto cuando es imperativo simple. Listen. Listen. Can you hear that sound? Listen. Can you hear that sound? Listen. Can you hear that sound? It's a rattlesnake. Serpiente cascabel. Listen. It's a cricket. Can you hear that sound? Listen. Listen to me. Listen to him. Listen to her. Listen to them. Listen to us. Listen to the music. Listen to the noise. Listen to, listen to, listen to, listen to, listen to, listen to, listen to. Please don't forget the two. All right? This is the last time I'm going to say it. In the previous class for beginners, I said listen to 45 times in a row. Seguidas. In order for it to penetrate in the hard head of my students who conveniently forget to when they say listen. Now to hear. Hear, heard, heard. To hear something is to capture it with your ear captures the sound, but you don't necessarily listen to it. You can hear me, but I can't hear you. You can see me, but I can't see you. All right? If I could see you, then maybe I could hear you, but I can't. Hear, heard, heard. Okay. By the way, in the next class, I'm going to bring Arnold Teller. Yeah, Arnold Teller. I'm going to bring the incredible Arnold. Yeah, Arnold Teller is going to be here with me in the next class. Aren't you impressed? Wow. Yeah, Arnold Teller is most. It's not often we have such a famous person with me on this program. Arnold Teller will be here. You don't know who? You've never heard of Arnold Teller? Come on. He's the most famous person in the world. You've never heard of Arnold Teller? Come on. He's really famous. You've never heard of Arnold Teller? Well, you're fairly ignorant. Come on. Let me ask you some questions. Have you ever heard of Dag Hammarskjöld? No? You've never heard of Dag Hammarskjöld? All right. Have you ever heard of Attila the Hun? Yeah? All right. You've heard of Attila the Hun. Attila. Rey de los Unos. Okay? Fine. Attila the Hun. But have you ever heard of Pericles? Yeah, it rings a bell, right? Pericles, yeah. It rings a bell. A Greek politician and statesman. Have you ever heard of Cyrus the Great? Ciro el Grande. Have you ever heard of Cyrus the Great? Have you ever heard of Mahatma Gandhi? You have? Okay. Have you ever heard of the Dave Clark Five? A British group from the 60s? Yeah. A very important competitor of the Beatles in the first 2 years of the Beatles. Yeah. Have you ever heard of Jerry and the Pacemakers? Have you ever heard of Peter and Gordon? British singers in the 1960s. Have you ever heard of Paul Revere? You've never heard of Paul Revere? Come on. Everybody has heard of Paul Revere. But have you ever heard of Paul Revere and the Raiders? Yeah. Have you ever heard of Mark Lindsay? No? You haven't? Well, have you ever heard of Arnold Schwarzenegger? Yeah. Everybody's heard of Arnold Schwarzenegger. Okay. The expression in English, have you heard of, or have you ever heard of, es que te suena el nombre. ¿Has oído alguna vez el nombre? Have you ever heard of? Now, have you heard about is ¿has oído lo último? And Spanish people confuse those two often. To hear of and to hear about. All right? I've never heard of, for example, Pedro Rosado. I've never heard of him. I don't know who he is. I've never heard of him. Huh? People tell me he's famous, but fine. I've never heard of him. Yeah. During the 1980s, I was so busy working that I didn't know what the Irish group U2 was. I'd never heard of them. And people looked at me and said, "What? You've never heard of U2? I said, "No, I haven't." Who's U2? What is U2? U2 is a spy plane from the 1950s and 1960s. But I didn't know it was an Irish rock group, U2. I'd never heard of them. I've never heard of. Now to hear about, hey, have you heard about Juanita? ¿Has oído lo último sobre Juanita? ¿Has oído lo que le pasó? Have you heard about? Have you heard about what happened? Have you heard about? Don't confuse those two. If I say, tomorrow in this class, I'm going to talk to you. I'm going to talk to you about Ho Chi Minh. And you say, I've never heard about Ho Chi Minh. No. I've never heard of. All right? So what you need to do is to take the names of famous people and ask an imaginary person or another real person in English, have you ever heard of? And the name of the person. Have you ever heard of Nikita Khrushchev? Have you ever heard of Robert Kennedy? Have you ever heard of Calvin Coolidge? Have you ever heard of William McKinley? Have you ever heard of James Hart? Have you ever heard of Davy Crockett? Have you ever heard of Daniel Boone? Have you ever heard of Benjamin Disraeli? Have you ever heard of William Gladstone? Have you ever heard of the anti-disestablishmentarians? Have you ever heard of, I don't know, David Hume? Have you ever heard of Adam Smith? Or in Spanish history, have you ever heard of the Arcipreste de Ita? Have you ever heard of Juan Valera? Have you ever heard of Clarín? Have you ever heard of Pérez de Ayala? Have you ever heard of Miguel de Unamuno? Have you ever heard of Ramón de Valle Inclán? Have you ever heard of Antonio Machado? Have you ever heard of El Padre Feijó? Have you ever heard of Gaspar Melchor de Jovellanos? Have you ever heard of these people? Have you ever heard of Thomas Hobbes? Have you ever heard of John Locke? Have you ever heard of? 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 Have you ever heard of her? Have you ever heard of me? Have you ever heard of him? Etc. We'll continue with the verb to hear. It's an important verb in many different ways.